And things started to change in the Black community, and unity was formed, and Islam sort of started to make an internal transformation for people, no matter what walk of life they were from. I mean, during that time, we look at the media and it shows what things were like during the civil rights era for the different groups. In the Black community, it was a time for them to grow, and for us to sort of change our place in the country and take back our rights. Whereas you see some of the media in sort of the upper class or white communities, you see it was all about music and dancing and American Bandstand. It was totally different. Whereas in the Black communities, there was something happening. There was this uprising going on. I just think that the differences are sort of great. You know, you see that, you know, people think that this time was, oh, it was such a great time for music and fashion. No, there was something going on in the Black communities. There was something great happening. And it's a lot of the things that happened at that time sort of changed the way the Black community saw themselves. And more, I believe more and more people started going to college, seeking a greater education. And it led to a lot of the civil rights that we have today. Okay, I can say what I know off the top of my head. In terms of my family, a lot of slaves were brought from the western coast of Africa, and they were brought here in these ships, and they had to endure these grueling conditions. There was no food. There was barely any food. There was barely any water. And it was entire families. It was entire families put into these cramped spaces. These cramped spaces. Actually, if you can go online or to different museums and you see how small these spaces were. You couldn't lift up your arms. You couldn't move your legs. Everyone was chained together by their feet. There were diseases. If someone got sick and it seemed like they wouldn't be able to be used in the slave trade, then they were thrown overboard. Children, wives, husbands, they were separated and they were killed. And I'm here today because someone survived that. And it's difficult for me to believe and understand. And I think that I take a lot of the things that I have today for granted. But someone went through that for me to be here today. And slaves were... a lot of the slaves were brought, actually, there was slavery in America, but actually most of the slaves that were brought from West Africa ended up in South America or in the coasts. So a lot of them, that's why you see a lot of Africans or people of African descent in Haiti. You see a lot of people of African descent in Cuba, all of these different islands and these places in South America, because the sugarcane was a really big crop. The closer you get to the equator, more sugarcane was like a really big crop. Whereas in North America and the modern day United States, the crops were tobacco and cotton. And slave traders would bring the people and they would make them all stand up. They would beat them into submission, and they would grease them down, and they would make them all stand in a line and to be sold as cattle. And they would have auctions, and they would sell them off to landowners and people who owned businesses, and they would have them work in fields. And I don't think people realize. Sometimes I think people fail to realize how difficult that could have been. It's sort of, they think of it in a perspective where, oh, it happened a long time ago, and oh, it was bad, but there are people around the world who suffered more. And I mean, that's true, and that could be true, but it wasn't a cakewalk. It wasn't like an easy thing. Women who were pregnant, they had their children alone, and the next day they had to go out and work again. They weren't given a chance to rest. I mean, think of how much pain they were in. A lot of people died from malnutrition. A lot of people were forced to work until the skin was taken from their bodies and their bones were weak, and families were separated, and that actually contributes to the dynamic of the African American community today. You see a lot of single mothers. You see a lot of families that are separated. They're not together. Well, it started during that time. I mean, imagine the people, imagine the tribes and the families that were torn apart in Africa and then brought here and torn apart again. It was a strategic measure, actually, by slave owners. It was a strategic measure to separate them so that they can lose their strength. When you don't have your family with you, you feel hopeless. So they couldn't organize. They couldn't free themselves if they were around people who spoke different languages than them. Women couldn't raise strong sons if there was no father in the household. So it created a weakness in the foundation of Black families in America. And there are stories about families being separated and men being losing their power and showing their wives that they were weak. I've read stories about African men being tied up on a carriage from each side and having one side of the horse's carriage go in one direction and the other side going to the other direction, and pulling their bodies apart until they completely separated. And I mean, imagine what that's like for a wife to see her husband go through that. She loses her trust. It's hard for her to trust, and maybe she feels some resentment towards him about, why aren't you protecting me? Why isn't this happening? And she might become bitter. And I think that plays a part. It definitely plays a part in the social dynamic of what it's like to be in the Black community. I think a lot of African American women feel like they have to be very strong for their families, which it took part in my family. I mean, my mother left my father and moved to Dallas. She didn't think twice. She felt like, this is what I have to do for my family. You're not there for me. This is what I have to do. That's been happening in the Black community for years, and it started in slavery. Oh, well, people think that slavery, people think that slavery ended with the emancipation and it ended in America and all slaves were freed at once and things just changed. But a lot of slaves actually, when they were freed, they just went back to slavery because they didn't have anything. I mean, what were they supposed to do? They didn't have any food. They didn't have any homes. So they actually stayed in slavery because it's all that they knew. And a lot of people, I mean, it was signed and it was declared that slaves were free, but I mean, there was no mass media at that time. It wasn't there was no TV, so they couldn't hear it on the radio. They couldn't find out about it in the internet. So a lot of slaves didn't find out for years, they were taken advantage of, or some of them were sharecropping. So they were actually in debt to their slave owners, so they had to stay on plantations and work. Some of them were freed, and we hear about a few of these stories, but for most people it was still very difficult. People think that slavery ended immediately, but actually the last slaves were freed in the 1960s. That was when the last slaves left their plantations. Maybe they were told to stay there. Maybe they felt like they couldn't leave. Maybe they didn't know. I mean, some areas of the Deep South, if you go to the Deep South of the United States, there are a lot of people who don't have cars. They don't have internet. Like it's totally different. It's much different. It seems like you're kind of, time traveling to the past.
What was the point?
It was a psychological effect. It started during racism. There were a lot of messages. It was kind of like, there are these letters called the Willie Lynch letters, and it's this book that basically goes through ways to keep the Black community in a mindset of submission. And unfortunately, we are still feeling the brunt of some of those things today. It takes education, it takes a willpower to want to change, which is what the Nation of Islam did for a lot of African Americans during the civil rights era in terms of empowerment. But a lot of the times, there are a lot of people today who feel like